I was standing in the middle of our church, hands shaking, heart racing, when my own parents decided to humiliate me in front of everyone I had ever known. My mother grabbed the microphone like she had been waiting for this moment her entire life, her voice dripping with disappointment as she called my marriage a disgrace, while my father stood behind her nodding like I was some kind of shame they needed to cleanse in public. And all around me, hundreds of people whispered, stared, judged, like I had committed some unforgivable sin just because I chose to love a man who had already lost everything once. My husband stood beside me, silent, gripping my hand tighter with every word they threw at us. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone in that room had been watching, waiting, and recording far more than just this moment. And just when I thought I couldn't feel more exposed, more broken, a voice from the back of the church suddenly cut through the silence. Calm, sharp, and deadly confident. And in that second, everything changed. My name is Emily. I'm 27, and until that day, I honestly believed my family's love came with conditions I could somehow meet if I just tried hard enough. But everything started falling apart the moment I met Daniel, a quiet, kind widower who had lost his wife in a car accident 2 years before I came into his life. And instead of seeing the strength it took for him to keep going, especially while raising his young daughter alone, my parents only saw what they wanted to judge, a man with baggage, a life that didn't fit their perfect image, and a relationship they could never control. At first, their disapproval was subtle, small comments at dinner, passive-aggressive remarks about starting fresh instead of picking up someone else's broken life. But over time, it turned into something darker, something louder, until the day they decided to make it public, to turn my love story into their personal sermon. And what hurt the most wasn't just what they said, it was how easily everyone around them believed it, how quickly I became the villain in a story that wasn't even mine anymore. I met Daniel on a random Tuesday afternoon at a quiet coffee shop I used to go to after work, the kind of place where nobody really notices you unless you want them to. And at first, he didn't stand out in any obvious way. He wasn't loud or overly confident, didn't try to impress anyone. But there was something about the way he sat there with his daughter, patiently helping her with her homework, while still managing to smile like she was the only thing that mattered in the world. And I remember thinking how rare that kind of presence felt. We didn't even speak that day, but somehow we kept running into each other, same time, same place, until one afternoon his daughter dropped her crayons near my table and I helped her pick them up. And that small moment turned into a conversation, then another. And before I knew it, Daniel and I had started sharing pieces of our lives in a way that felt natural, easy, almost like we had known each other for years. He told me about his late wife, not in a way that made me feel like I was competing with a memory, but in a way that showed how deeply he had loved and how much it had cost him to lose her. And instead of scaring me, it made me respect him more, because he wasn't pretending to be someone untouched by Cain. He was someone who had survived it, and that mattered to me more than anything. When he finally asked me out, it wasn't some grand gesture, just a simple, "Would you like to have dinner with us sometime?" Because his daughter was always part of the equation. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be a typical relationship. This was a ready-made life, one that came with responsibility, history, and a kind of love that had already been tested in ways most people never experience. I knew my parents wouldn't understand. They had always had a very specific idea of what my life should look like. Perfect husband, perfect timeline, perfect image. But I still believed, maybe naively, that if they met Daniel, if they saw the way he treated me, the way he cared for his daughter, the way he carried his past with honesty instead of hiding it, they would come around. So I introduced them, hoping for at least a chance. But from the moment Daniel walked into their house, I could feel the shift. The way my mother's smile tightened, the way my father's questions felt less like curiosity and more like interrogation, asking about his late wife in a tone that felt almost invasive, like they were measuring whether his grief made him less worthy. And when they found out he had a child, it was like everything inside them shut down completely. My mother later pulling me aside to whisper that I was settling for leftovers, a phrase that hit me so hard I couldn't even respond in the moment, because it wasn't just disrespectful to Daniel, it was cruel to his daughter, an innocent little girl who had already lost her mother. I tried to defend him, to explain that love doesn't come packaged the way they wanted it to. But every conversation turned into an argument. Every attempt at understanding turned into criticism. And slowly I realized this wasn't about concern. It was about control. About the fact that I had chosen something they didn't approve of, something they couldn't mold or manage. And instead of accepting it, they started pushing back harder, making comments in front of relatives, questioning my decisions publicly, turning what should have been a private disagreement into something that followed me everywhere. And even then, I kept hoping it would get better, that eventually they would see what I saw. But deep down, I think I already knew they wouldn't, and that it was only a matter of time before they took it too far. Things didn't explode all at once. They built slowly, like pressure you don't notice until something finally cracks. And for me, that crack came the night my parents invited extended family over for what they called a casual dinner, which I now realize was anything but casual, because the moment Daniel and I walked in, I could feel the tension in the room, the way conversations quieted just slightly too fast, the way eyes lingered a little too long, and I knew my parents had already been talking about us behind our backs. At first, everything was polite. Forced smiles, small talk, my mother playing the perfect host. But it didn't take long before the comments started slipping in. Subtle at first. My aunt asking Daniel how difficult it must be to raise someone else's child alone, ignoring the fact that it was his own daughter, while my father laughed it off like it was just a joke. And I could see Daniel trying to stay composed, trying not to react. But I knew him well enough to recognize when he was quietly enduring something painful. Then my mother brought up his late wife at the dinner table, asking questions that were far too personal, comparing timelines, implying that I had somehow inserted myself into a life that wasn't meant for me. And when I tried to shut it down, she turned it on me, saying I was being defensive because I knew she was right. And that's when the room shifted from uncomfortable to unbearable, because suddenly it wasn't just conversation anymore, it was judgment, open and unapologetic. Daniel excused himself shortly after, saying he needed some air, and I followed him outside, finding him standing in the dark with his hands clenched, trying to steady his breathing. And it broke something inside me to see him like that, because he had done nothing to deserve this, none of it. And yet he was the one paying the price for my family's cruelty. He told me he didn't want to come between me and my parents, that maybe they were right and I deserved something easier, something without complications. But hearing him say that only made me more certain of my choice. Because love isn't supposed to be easy, it's supposed to be real. And what I had with him was real in a way I had never experienced before. I reassured him, told him I wasn't going anywhere, that I chose him not in spite of his past, but because of the man he had become through it. And for a moment, standing there away from everyone else, it felt like we could handle anything together. But what I didn't realize was that my parents weren't done, not even close. Because a few days later, my mother called me with a tone that sounded strangely calm, almost rehearsed, and told me that the pastor wanted to speak with us that Sunday, that there were concerns about the example I was setting for the community. And that was the first time I felt something colder than anger, something closer to fear, because this was no longer just about family disagreements or private humiliation. This was about them taking it into a space that mattered to me, a place where I had grown up, where my faith had been shaped, where I had always felt safe. And suddenly, they were turning that into a stage. And I had no idea just how far they were willing to go until I walked into that church and realized I wasn't just attending a service. I was walking straight into an ambush.
That Sunday started like any other. Sunlight pouring through the stained glass, people greeting each other with warm smiles, the familiar comfort of a place I had trusted my entire life. But the moment Daniel and I walked in, I knew something was off, because the whispers started almost immediately. Quiet, but impossible to ignore. Heads turning, eyes following us down the aisle as if we had already been judged before the service even began. And when I looked toward my parents sitting near the front, my mother's expression wasn't welcoming. It was expectant, like she had been waiting for this exact moment to unfold. We took our seats anyway, Daniel's hand finding mine, steady and reassuring, but I could feel the tension building with every passing minute, every hymn, every glance, until the pastor finally stepped up to speak, and instead of starting with the usual message, he paused, his eyes scanning the room before settling somewhere in our direction. And that's when my heart started pounding so hard I thought everyone around me could hear it. He began talking about moral responsibility, about the sanctity of family structure, words that felt general at first, but quickly became pointed, specific. And then, without warning, my mother stood up, walked toward the front, and asked for the microphone, her heels echoing against the floor in a way that made the entire room fall silent. And I remember thinking just for a second that maybe she wouldn't actually do it, that maybe there was still a line she wouldn't cross. But the moment she turned to face the congregation, I realized I had been wrong. She spoke with a calm confidence that made everything worse, telling everyone how heartbroken she was over the choices I had made, how I had turned away from the life I was raised to live. And then she said it out loud in front of hundreds of people, that I had chosen to marry a widower with a child instead of building a proper family, as if love had some kind of acceptable order, as if Daniel's past made him less deserving of a future. And I felt the weight of every stare, every judgment crashing down on me all at once. My father stood up beside her, backing her words, saying they had tried to guide me, but I refused to listen, that they couldn't stay silent while I made a mistake that would define my life. And I wanted to disappear. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me whole, because this wasn't just embarrassment anymore, it was betrayal on a level I had never imagined. And when I looked at Daniel, I saw something shift in his eyes. Not anger, not even hurt, but a quiet resignation that scared me more than anything, like he was already preparing himself to walk away for my sake. The pastor didn't stop them, didn't intervene, just stood there as if this was all part of the plan. And for a moment, I felt completely alone, like everyone I had ever trusted had decided I was the problem. But just as my mother was about to continue, just as the silence in that room became unbearable, a chair scraped loudly from the back of the church, cutting through everything, and a voice spoke up, steady and unmistakably confident, saying, "I think that's enough." And in that instant, every head turned, including mine, toward the person who had just interrupted. And I had no idea who they were yet, but something about the way they stood there, completely unafraid, told me that whatever was about to happen next was going to change everything. The entire room went still as that voice echoed forward, and when the man stepped into the aisle, walking calmly toward the front like he belonged there more than anyone else, I saw something shift not just in the crowd, but in my parents' faces for the first time that day. Uncertainty, real and visible. And as he got closer, I realized I had seen him before, though only briefly, at a charity event Daniel had once taken me to. A man he had spoken to with quiet respect, someone important but never mentioned in detail. And now here he was, standing between my parents and the microphone, asking politely but firmly if he could speak, and before anyone could object, he took it.
Turning to face the congregation with a calm authority that instantly commanded attention, he introduced himself as someone who had worked closely with Daniel over the past 2 years, not just professionally, but personally. And then he said something that made my heart stop. He told them Daniel hadn't just been rebuilding his life after loss, he had been quietly funding multiple community programs, supporting families in need, paying for children's education, including several within that very church, all without ever attaching his name to it. And suddenly, the room that had been so quick to judge fell into a stunned silence, because this wasn't the story they had been told. My mother tried to interrupt, her voice sharp, insisting that generosity didn't excuse poor life choices. But the man didn't even raise his voice when he responded. He simply said that integrity isn't defined by someone's past, but by what they choose to do with it. And then he did something none of us expected. He revealed that he had been documenting the outreach programs Daniel supported, including conversations with people whose lives had been changed. And more importantly, he had also been present at more than one of the private family gatherings my parents thought were safe spaces to criticize and belittle, because some of those events had been public enough to be recorded. And as he spoke, he held up his phone, calmly explaining that while today's display was shocking, it wasn't new. It was just the first time it had been done so openly. And the tension in the room flipped completely, whispers turning from judgment to disbelief, then to something sharper, something directed not at me, but at my parents. My father tried to regain control, stepping forward, raising his voice, accusing the man of twisting the narrative. But it was too late, because the moment he said that, a few people in the audience began pulling out their own phones, recognizing pieces of what was being described, connecting dots they hadn't seen before. And the image my parents had built so carefully, the one rooted in moral authority and public respect, started cracking right there in front of everyone. And then came the final blow. The man turned back to me and Daniel, his tone softening just slightly, and said that some people use faith as a shield to hide judgment, while others live it quietly through their actions, and that in all the time he had known Daniel, he had never once seen him treat anyone with anything but compassion. And in that moment, the silence in the church wasn't heavy anymore, it was revealing, because for the first time that day, I wasn't the one being questioned. My parents were, and they had no idea how to recover from it. In the days that followed, everything unraveled faster than I ever thought possible, because the same people who had sat there silently judging me began questioning my parents instead, asking how they could preach compassion while publicly tearing down their own daughter. And the recordings that man mentioned didn't stay private for long. Clips of their comments, their tone, their cruelty spreading far beyond that church, forcing them to face the very kind of public scrutiny they had tried to put me through. My parents tried to reach out, of course, messages filled with excuses disguised as concern, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to respond because I finally understood something that day. I wasn't the one who needed their approval. They were the ones who had lost something real. Daniel and I walked away from that place, not ashamed, but stronger, building a life rooted in respect, love, and truth instead of appearances. And as for karma, it didn't come in anger or revenge. It came in clarity, in exposure, in the quiet but undeniable shift of who people chose to believe. So if you've ever been judged for loving someone the world doesn't understand, remember this. Truth has a way of showing up exactly when it needs to, and when it does, it changes everything. And if this story hit you even a little, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because you never know who needs to hear that their story isn't over yet.